The sun was setting over the hills of Tennessee, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pale gold. The light moved gently across the empty fields, brushing over the fences and barns that had stood for generations. Helen walked slowly along the narrow dirt path that led to her farmhouse. The ground was dry under her shoes, and the air carried the quiet scent of pine and dust. That evening felt no different from any other, yet there was a strange calm in the silence, as if the world was holding its breath for something about to happen. The farmhouse stood at the edge of the valley, a simple wooden structure with peeling paint and a porch that leaned ever so slightly to one side. It had once been full of life. There were years when laughter had echoed through its walls, when the sound of her husband's boots at the door meant safety and love. But now the rooms were quiet, and Helen lived with only the sound of the wind slipping through the cracks in the boards. Her husband had passed away 2 winters ago, leaving her with a house that felt too large and memories that refused to fade. Every morning she kept herself busy with chores, even if there was little reason to do so. The habit gave her comfort. The kitchen window overlooked the same field where her husband used to plant corn, and sometimes she would catch herself talking to him as if he could still hear. It was not grief alone that filled her days. It was the weight of time, the kind that presses on the heart when a person has lived long enough to lose more than they can count. That particular evening, she was returning from the church in town. Pastor Lewis had asked her to help sort through a few donations for the upcoming charity event. She had agreed, partly because she wanted to help, and partly because she did not want to go straight home. The air outside was easier to bear than the silence waiting inside her house. As she walked past the last bend in the path, her eyes caught something unusual by the fence. At first, she thought it was just a bundle of clothes someone had left behind, but then the shape moved. She stopped. The light from the setting sun reached the ground near the fence, revealing the small figure of a boy curled up against one of the posts. His clothes were dirty and torn, his hair a mess of dust and sweat. He looked too thin, like he had not eaten properly for days. Helen's first instinct was to be cautious. The area was quiet and strangers rarely came this far from town, but the boy looked no older than 12, and there was nothing threatening in his face, only fear and exhaustion. She stepped closer and spoke softly, asking if he was all right. The boy lifted his head, but did not answer. His lips trembled, and he pressed his arms around himself, as if trying to stay warm, even though the evening air was still. Helen could see that his shoes were worn through and his hands were scratched, as though he had been walking for miles. Something in his eyes made her heart tighten. It was a look she recognized too well, the kind of lostness that no child should ever carry. Without thinking much more, she reached out her hand and told him to come inside so he could wash up and eat something. For a moment he hesitated, as if unsure whether to trust her. Then he nodded and followed her toward the house. His steps were unsteady, and she slowed her pace so he could keep up. By the time they reached the porch, the last of the sunlight had faded, leaving a quiet gray across the valley. Inside the kitchen, Helen lit a small lamp and watched as the boy sat down at the table. He kept his eyes lowered, avoiding her gaze. She placed a bowl of soup in front of him and waited. At first he only looked at it. Then he began to eat, slowly, as if every bite might be taken from him. Helen did not ask too many questions. She had learned long ago that people in pain rarely speak the truth right away. What mattered most in that moment was that he ate, that he felt safe. After a while, she noticed that his hands were shaking slightly, not from cold, but from hunger. When he finished, she asked him his name. He hesitated before answering. "Jacob," he said quietly. The name came out almost as a whisper, and Helen could tell it might not even be his real one, but she did not press him. She simply nodded and told him he could stay the night. There was a small room at the end of the hallway that used to belong to her nephew when he visited years ago. It still had an old bed and a quilt she had made herself. As the boy followed her down the hallway, she caught a glimpse of something on his wrist. It looked like a small scar, round and faded, almost like a burn mark. She did not mention it, but the image stayed in her mind. Once he was settled, she went back to the kitchen and sat down near the window. The lamp flickered, and outside the night spread quietly across the hills. She tried to understand what could have brought that boy to her fence at that hour. Maybe he had run away from home. Maybe he had no one left. The thought filled her with an ache she could not explain. The next morning, she woke early to the sound of birds outside the window. The sun was already bright, and the sky was clear after a long stretch of cloudy days. For a moment, she wondered if the boy had gone, but when she stepped into the hallway, she saw him sitting on the floor, folding the blanket neatly on the bed. He looked startled when she appeared, as if he expected to be scolded. Helen smiled and told him there was no need to rush. She had made breakfast, and he was welcome to join her. As they sat at the table, she asked if he had any family nearby. He shook his head. His eyes dropped again, and his voice barely rose above a whisper when he said that his parents had died. Helen did not ask how. There was too much pain in his expression for her to doubt him. Instead, she asked where he had been living before he came here. He said he had been moving from town to town, sleeping wherever he could. It was clear he did not want to go into detail. Throughout the day, she let him help with small tasks. He carried wood from the shed, fed the chickens, and helped wash the dishes. He worked quietly, never complaining, always careful not to break anything. Helen noticed how quickly he looked for approval, how a small nod from her seemed to mean everything. It reminded her of the way her husband used to guide their younger relatives during the summers. The boy's need for kindness felt like a mirror of her own loneliness. That afternoon, when the sun dipped lower, Helen decided to walk with Jacob to the edge of the property. She wanted to show him the small stream that ran through the field, a place where she often went to think. The path was narrow and lined with tall grass. As they walked, the boy glanced around constantly, his eyes searching the trees as if expecting someone to appear. Helen asked if he was afraid of something, but he said no. Still, the unease did not leave his face. When they reached the stream, Helen sat on a rock and let her feet rest in the cool water. Jacob stood nearby, looking at the reflection of the sky on the surface. After a while, he asked in a small voice if she ever got lonely. The question took her by surprise. She said that sometimes she did, but that she had learned to keep faith. Life, she told him, has a way of sending people exactly when we need them. Jacob nodded slowly, though his eyes stayed on the water. There was something old in his expression, something that did not belong to a child. As they walked back, she caught him looking toward the distant road more than once. It seemed he was waiting for someone who never came. That night, after he had gone to bed, Helen sat again by the kitchen window. The wind had picked up, carrying the sound of the trees moving like waves. She thought about the boy's eyes, the scar on his wrist, and the way he spoke of his parents. Something about his story did not fit, but she pushed the thought aside. What mattered was that he was safe now. In the following days, a quiet routine grew between them. Jacob helped her repair the fence, clean the barn, and bring water from the well. The farmhouse began to feel less empty, and Helen noticed a lightness in her heart she had not felt in years. The laughter that had vanished with her husband's passing began to return in small ways. Sometimes she would find Jacob sitting by the porch steps, carving small pieces of wood into shapes. One morning, he handed her one of them, a tiny bird, smooth and simple, carved with care. She thanked him and placed it on the windowsill. But even as peace settled over the house, something deeper stirred beneath it. Helen began to notice little things, the way Jacob avoided certain questions, the way he would wake up from dreams that left him shaken, the way he sometimes whispered a name she could not quite hear. There were moments when she caught him staring at an old photograph of her husband that hung in the living room. When she asked what he was looking at, he only said that the man looked familiar. That night, after Jacob had gone to sleep, Helen stood by the photo and studied it herself. Her husband's kind eyes stared back at her, unchanged by time. She wondered what kind of connection a boy like Jacob could possibly have with a man who had died years ago. It was an impossible thought, yet it would not leave her mind. Outside, the crickets began their quiet chorus. The house felt alive again, but the mystery of who Jacob really was only beginning to unfold. The next morning arrived with a golden calm that stretched across the valley. The fog lifted slowly from the fields, revealing rows of wet grass shining like glass. Helen opened the window and let the fresh air drift inside. It smelled of rain and soil, a smell that always reminded her of beginnings. She glanced toward the small room down the hallway and saw the door slightly open. Jacob was awake, sitting quietly on the edge of his bed, tying his worn shoes with careful hands. He looked up when she passed by, offering a shy smile that carried more gratitude than words ever could. They ate breakfast together, the same way they had each day since he arrived. The rhythm of life at the farmhouse had changed, not by great gestures, but by small habits that slowly built a sense of home. Helen had not realized how much she missed sharing a table with someone. Jacob still spoke little, but sometimes she would catch him watching her with a kind of silent curiosity, as if he were studying the way she moved, the way she folded her napkin or hummed softly while cooking. There was tenderness in his attention, and it made her heart soften in ways she had not expected. That morning, she asked if he wanted to accompany her into town. She needed to visit Pastor Lewis to drop off some baked goods for the church fair. Jacob hesitated for a moment but agreed. The road into town was long, about 3 miles of dusty trail lined with wildflowers and patches of corn. As they walked, Helen told him stories about the people who lived nearby, about the harvest seasons and the fairs they used to have every summer. Jacob listened closely, his eyes bright whenever she spoke about children playing by the river or music drifting through the fields during the celebrations. When they reached the church, Pastor Lewis was sweeping the front steps. He was an older man with gentle eyes and a steady voice. Helen introduced Jacob and explained that he had been staying with her for a few days. The pastor nodded kindly and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, saying that everyone was welcome in God's house. Jacob smiled faintly, but Helen noticed how tense he became when the pastor asked where he was from. Before she could explain, Jacob said he came from farther north, though he did not mention a town. The pastor gave him a warm look and said that sometimes it was not about where we came from, but where we were going. After they left the church, Helen stopped by the small general store to buy flour and soap. While she spoke with the shopkeeper, she saw Jacob wander toward the shelf of toys and trinkets. He picked up a small wooden cross on a string and turned it over in his hands. When she came to pay for her groceries, she added the cross to her purchase and handed it to him outside the store. He looked surprised, then smiled, clutching it tightly. It was the first real smile she had seen on his face, and it warmed her more than the sunlight. As they walked back home, Jacob began to open up a little. He told her about a few places he had passed through, though his stories were vague. He spoke about sleeping under bridges, about trains that passed in the night, about kind strangers who gave him food. Helen listened quietly, letting him share what he could. When he mentioned that he once stayed near a town called Maple Creek, she stopped for a moment. Her husband had grown up near Maple Creek. She asked if he remembered any names or faces from there, but Jacob shook his head quickly, saying it had been too long ago. That night, Helen could not sleep. The connection between the boy and that town kept circling in her thoughts. She told herself it was only coincidence, but something about the way he spoke, the way he looked at the photo of her husband, continued to stir questions she could not silence. She finally rose from bed and went to check on him. The door to his room was half open, and she saw him lying awake, staring at the ceiling. When he noticed her, he sat up quickly, saying he was fine. Helen told him softly that he did not need to be afraid here, that no one would hurt him. The boy nodded, but his eyes betrayed a sadness that words could not cover. Days passed, and the valley began to shift from summer's warmth toward autumn's cool edge. Leaves turned gold and red, falling gently over the yard. Helen and Jacob worked side by side, stacking firewood, cleaning the barn, and preparing the garden for the coming frost. Their bond grew stronger, though a quiet mystery lingered between them, like a fog that refused to lift. One afternoon, while cleaning an old trunk in the attic, Helen found a small tin box filled with letters her husband had written during his younger years. She sat near the window reading them, smiling at the words of love and faith that had once guided her life. Jacob came up the stairs quietly and asked what she was reading. She showed him one of the letters and told him it was written by her husband long ago. He sat beside her, his eyes following every line of the page, as if the handwriting itself meant something to him. Helen noticed his hands tremble slightly. When she asked if he was cold, he shook his head. After a moment of silence, he asked what her husband was like. She said he was a kind man who believed in forgiveness more than punishment, in truth, more than pride. Jacob looked away then, whispering almost to himself that some people do not deserve forgiveness. That sentence lingered in the air. Helen felt a strange chill, but did not press him further. The next day, as she prepared lunch, Jacob came running from the barn holding an old photograph he had found inside a cracked frame. The picture showed a group of men working near a river, one of whom was her husband in his early years. But what caught her attention was the way Jacob stared at another man in the photo, standing beside her husband. She asked if he recognized him. Jacob hesitated before nodding slightly, saying he thought he had seen that man somewhere. When Helen turned the photo over, she saw a name scribbled faintly on the back, Thomas Gray. That name meant little to her, but the way Jacob reacted told her it meant much more to him. He became withdrawn after that, speaking less, spending more time alone near the field. Helen watched him from the window, trying to understand what thoughts filled his young mind. Each night she prayed, asking for wisdom to handle whatever truth lay hidden behind the boy's silence. She felt that God had brought him to her for a reason, though she did not yet know what that reason was. One evening, as the sun disappeared behind the trees, Jacob approached her with a question that caught her off guard. He asked if people could ever make peace with what they had done, even if what they did was unforgivable. Helen thought carefully before answering. She said that forgiveness does not erase the past, but it frees the heart from carrying it forever. Jacob nodded slowly, tears forming in his eyes, and walked away without saying another word. She did not follow him. Some burdens, she knew, needed to be spoken in their own time. Later that night, Helen went to check on him and found him asleep with the small wooden cross clutched tightly in his hand. The sight filled her with both sorrow and hope. Whatever darkness the boy carried, she believed light could still reach it. But deep inside, she began to sense that his story was not one of simple loss. There was something more, something that connected him to her life in a way neither of them yet understood. The next morning, as she stood by the porch watching the mist rise from the fields, she saw a figure approaching along the dirt road. It was rare to see anyone come that far out. The man wore a dark coat and carried a small satchel. When he reached the fence, he tipped his hat and asked politely if she was Mrs. Helen Ward. She said yes. The man introduced himself as Sheriff Hayes from Maple Creek County. The name made her heart skip. He explained that they had been looking for a missing boy named Jacob Gray for weeks. Helen's hands went cold. She turned toward the house where the boy was still asleep and felt a rush of fear mixed with confusion. The sheriff noticed her expression and assured her that the boy was not in trouble, that they simply needed to confirm his safety. He said Jacob's father, Thomas Gray, had been found dead near the old riverbank weeks ago. Helen's breath caught. Thomas Gray. The same name from the photograph, the same man her husband once worked with. The sheriff added that before the man died, he had left behind a note mentioning a child who might still be alive. When the sheriff left, promising to return later that day, Helen stood frozen on the porch. The wind had picked up, stirring the dry leaves around her feet. Everything she had believed about the boy began to shift. He was not just a lost child. He was the son of a man who had once stood beside her husband. The realization opened a door to the past she thought was long closed. Inside the house, Jacob woke to the sound of the creaking floorboards. Helen stood by the doorway, her eyes filled with 1,000 unspoken questions. Before she could say anything, Jacob spoke softly. He said he knew someone would come looking for him, but he never expected it to be her who found him first. The silence that followed felt endless, heavy with truth yet to be told. Where in the world are you watching from? Leave it down below in the comments. The rest of that day moved in slow motion. Helen tried to keep herself occupied, folding laundry, sweeping the porch, stirring soup that simmered longer than it should have. Her hands performed the familiar tasks, but her mind wandered through pieces of memory she had not touched in years. The name Thomas Gray had opened a door to a time when her husband was still alive, and the valley was filled with the laughter of neighbors who came to help with the harvest. She remembered her husband speaking once about a man named Thomas, someone who had worked with him at the lumber mill. He had mentioned that Thomas was a troubled man, a widower who struggled to raise his son alone. But she had never met the boy, never heard what became of them, until now. Jacob spent the morning near the barn, quiet and withdrawn. When Helen brought him a plate of food, he thanked her softly, but did not eat much. She could see the storm in his eyes, the kind that comes when the past refuses to stay buried. She wanted to ask him everything, but held back. There was a fear in his silence, a fear she recognized as the kind that comes from shame rather than guilt. By afternoon, clouds began to gather over the valley. The air grew heavy and the light dimmed. Helen watched from the window as Jacob walked toward the small stream at the edge of the property, the same place where they had spoken days earlier. She followed at a distance, letting him have space but unwilling to leave him alone completely. When he reached the stream, he sat on a rock and stared into the water. His reflection rippled with each passing breeze, as if even his image could not stay still. She finally approached and sat beside him. For a long time they said nothing. The sound of water filled the silence between them. Then Jacob spoke, his voice trembling as he said he had known her husband. Helen turned sharply toward him. He explained that his father used to tell stories about a kind man named Samuel Ward, who once worked with him and helped him through difficult times. Samuel, her husband, had given Thomas food when his wages were short, had helped fix the roof of their house when storms nearly tore it apart. Jacob said his father called him a man of faith, someone who believed that every good deed was a seed planted in heaven. Tears filled Helen's eyes. She remembered that kindness well. Her husband never spoke of it as charity. To him, it was simply what good people did for one another. Jacob continued speaking, saying that his father had always wanted to repay that kindness, but never got the chance. Then his voice broke as he said that something terrible happened between them years later, something he did not understand fully, but it had torn their families apart. Helen's heart tightened. She asked what he meant. Jacob hesitated, then said that his father had once been accused of stealing money from the mill. The accusation came suddenly, and everyone turned against him. The only person who defended him was Samuel Ward. But even his defense had not been enough to save Thomas's job or his reputation. He had left town soon after, taking Jacob with him. For years they moved from place to place, never staying long enough to call anywhere home. Jacob said his father carried a deep anger, not at Samuel, but at the men who had lied. When he died, he told Jacob to find a woman named Helen Ward if he ever got lost, because she would show him kindness, just as her husband once did. Helen sat in silence, her hands shaking. She realized that the boy had not stumbled upon her farm by accident. He had come because his father had sent him, even from beyond the grave. A rush of emotion swept over her. Sorrow for the pain those men had caused, gratitude that the child had found his way to her, and confusion about what she was meant to do now. The storm that had been gathering finally broke. Rain began to fall in thick drops, soaking the grass and filling the stream until it overflowed. Helen and Jacob ran back toward the house, laughing breathlessly as thunder rolled across the sky. For a brief moment, the weight of their shared past lifted, replaced by something lighter, almost joyful. Inside, she handed him a towel and watched him dry his hair, smiling for the first time that day. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Helen told him stories about her husband, how he used to whistle while fixing the fence, how he loved to read the Bible before bed, how he always said that kindness had a longer life than pain. Jacob listened intently, his eyes reflecting the firelight. When she finished, he whispered that he wished he could have met him. Helen placed her hand over his and said that in some ways he already had. Days turned into weeks, and the bond between them grew deeper. The sheriff had not returned yet, and Helen secretly hoped he would not. She knew she should inform him that the boy was still there, but her heart could not bear the thought of losing him. Jacob had become part of her days, filling the house with laughter, small chores, and the quiet comfort of shared meals. The loneliness that had once lived in every corner of her home seemed to fade. One morning, while sorting through the old trunk again, Helen found a small Bible that had belonged to her husband. Inside the cover was a note written in his handwriting. It said, "If this book ever reaches a child in need, know that you are loved beyond measure." She showed it to Jacob, and he held it as if it were something sacred. He asked if he could keep it. Helen nodded, saying that her husband would have wanted that, but their peace did not last long. Late one night, Helen awoke to the sound of footsteps outside the house. The rain had stopped, and the world was quiet except for the faint creak of the porch boards. She rose from bed and peered through the window. A man was standing near the gate, his face hidden in the shadows. He wore a dark coat like the sheriff, but she could not be sure. Her heart pounded. She went to Jacob's room, but the bed was empty. Panic surged through her. She grabbed a lamp and stepped onto the porch. The man turned at the sound, revealing not the sheriff but a stranger with sharp eyes and a weathered face. He asked if she was harboring a boy named Jacob Gray. His tone carried neither kindness nor patience. Helen demanded to know who he was, but he only said he worked for men who wanted the boy found for reasons she would not understand. Fear spread through her, but she refused to let it show. She said the boy was not there, though her voice trembled slightly. The man stared at her for a long moment, then stepped closer, his boots sinking into the wet ground. Before he could speak again, Jacob appeared from behind the barn, holding a small stick like a weapon. He shouted for the man to leave her alone. The stranger smirked and said that the boy had his father's courage. Then he turned and walked back toward the road, disappearing into the night. Helen ran to Jacob, her hands shaking as she pulled him close. He told her that he had heard the man's voice and recognized it from the night his father died. The men who worked with his father had taken something from him, something his father had tried to hide, and now they wanted it back. The truth was beginning to surface, and Helen knew their quiet days were over. Morning light spread softly across the valley, and the fields glowed with dew like silver dust. Helen stood on the porch, holding her coffee cup, her eyes fixed on the distant trees where the stranger had disappeared the night before. The silence after his visit was heavier than before. Every sound, the wind, the creak of the porch boards, even the birds, seemed to echo her unease. She had lived through storms and losses, but this fear was different. It was the kind that whispered of secrets waiting too long to be faced. Jacob came out quietly, his steps careful as if afraid to disturb her thoughts. His face looked tired, but there was determination in his eyes. He sat beside her without speaking, and for a while they both just listened to the world waking up. Finally, Helen asked what the man had wanted. Jacob said he was one of the men who used to work with his father. He said they believed his father had hidden something valuable before he died, something those men wanted to find. Helen asked what it was, but Jacob only shook his head. He said his father never told him, only that it was something dangerous, something meant to stay buried. Helen's stomach tightened. She thought about the things her husband had kept from the mill days, old papers, ledgers, and tools, stored away in boxes that no one had touched for years. Could the past be reaching for them again through this boy? She felt torn between fear and faith. The instinct to protect him was stronger than the questions pressing in her mind. She told Jacob that no one would take him from that house, no matter what they were looking for. Later that morning, Helen went to town under the pretense of buying supplies. The streets were quiet, with only a few wagons rolling down the main road. She stopped by the post office and sent a letter to Pastor Lewis, asking him to visit soon. Something inside her told her she would need his wisdom. When she returned home, she found Jacob sitting by the stream again, carving another small figure from wood. He looked calmer, as if the rhythm of carving steadied his heart. She sat beside him and asked if he believed God had a plan for everyone, even those who had done wrong. He looked at her with serious eyes and said maybe God's plan was not to erase what people had done, but to teach others what forgiveness really meant. That night, the sheriff returned. His arrival was quieter than before, but his face carried concern. He told Helen they had found tracks near the property, boot prints matching those of the man who had visited her porch. He warned that whoever the man was, he was likely desperate. Helen nodded, hiding the tremor in her hands. The sheriff asked to see Jacob, and Helen led him inside. The boy greeted him politely, his voice steady. The sheriff asked a few questions, then sighed. He said the case of Thomas Gray's death was still under investigation, but there were signs that others had been involved. He told Helen that Jacob might be in danger and should stay away from town for a while. Before leaving, he said quietly that the truth always found its way to the surface, no matter how deep it was buried. After the sheriff left, Helen locked the doors and sat by the fire. Jacob joined her, clutching the Bible she had given him. He said he had prayed for his father's soul and for strength to face what was coming. Helen looked at him, realizing how much he had grown in spirit since the day she found him by the fence. The child who arrived hungry and scared had become someone brave enough to protect others. Over the following days, small changes filled the air. Helen began to notice unfamiliar things around the farm: a gate left open, footprints near the barn, a window latch that no longer closed properly. She told herself it might be animals or her own worry, but her instinct said otherwise. One evening, as she was putting away dishes, she heard a noise from the attic. The sound was faint but distinct, like a box being moved. She called Jacob, and they climbed the stairs together. The air smelled of dust and cedar. The attic was dim, lit only by the fading daylight through a small window. At first, everything looked untouched. Then Jacob pointed to a corner where one of the old trunks was slightly open. Inside was a collection of her husband's belongings, letters, ledgers, and tools from the mill. Helen knelt beside it and opened the top layer. Among the papers was an envelope sealed with wax. She had never seen it before. On the front, in her husband's handwriting, were the words, "For Helen, when the time is right." Her heart pounded as she broke the seal and unfolded the paper inside. The letter was brief, but heavy with meaning. Her husband wrote that years ago he had discovered that certain men at the mill were stealing from the workers' fund and framing others for their crimes. One of those men was Thomas Gray's supervisor. He had tried to expose them, but before he could, the mill closed and the men disappeared. Her husband wrote that he had hidden the proof somewhere safe, hoping one day the truth would find its way to light. He warned that if anything ever happened to him, she should trust whoever came carrying a pure heart and a burden of loss. Helen's eyes filled with tears. The words connected everything: the boy, the stranger, the sheriff, the lingering fear. She turned to Jacob and told him that his father had been innocent. Jacob froze, his lips parting in shock. She handed him the letter, and he read it silently, his hands shaking. When he looked up, tears streamed down his face. He said he had always believed his father's story, but no one ever listened. Now, holding her husband's words, he had the proof he needed. They decided to hide the letter in a safer place until they could figure out what to do. Helen suggested waiting for Pastor Lewis before showing anyone else. That night, neither of them slept much. Every sound outside seemed louder than usual. Sometime after midnight, Helen heard a horse on the road. She peeked through the curtain and saw two men dismounting near the fence. One of them was the stranger from before. Her heart raced. She woke Jacob quietly, and together they slipped into the cellar beneath the kitchen. They sat in silence as footsteps approached the porch. The men spoke in hushed voices, one saying that the woman must have the papers. The other replied that they would search every inch until they found them. Helen gripped Jacob's hand tightly. The footsteps creaked across the floor above them, the boards groaning under the weight. She prayed silently, asking for strength. After what felt like hours, the sound faded and the men left. Only then did she allow herself to breathe again. By dawn, the valley was silent once more. Helen and Jacob emerged from the cellar, shaken but safe. The house was a mess, drawers pulled open and papers scattered, but the letter remained hidden. She knew this was far from over. The men would return, and next time they might not come quietly. She sat Jacob down and told him that they needed help, that the truth his father had died for could not stay buried any longer. He nodded, his face pale but resolute. He said he would do whatever it took to clear his father's name. Helen looked at him and saw not a lost boy, but a young man standing at the edge of courage. That That afternoon, they rode into town together to find Pastor Lewis. The church bell rang softly as they entered, and the pastor greeted them with surprise. Helen handed him the letter, explaining everything. He read it carefully, then looked up with tears in his eyes. He said that faith had strange ways of bringing justice to light, and that perhaps God had chosen them both for this moment. He promised to keep the letter safe and contact the authorities he trusted. As they left the church, Helen felt the weight on her chest lift slightly. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt his presence not as sorrow, but as guidance. Jacob walked beside her, his eyes steady, his hand still holding the small wooden cross. The valley stretched ahead, quiet but full of meaning. They did not know what awaited them, but one thing was certain: the truth was no longer hidden, and the boy who had come to her fence as a stranger had become part of her destiny. The following morning, a soft mist hung low over the fields, and the air carried the damp smell of soil and rain. Helen watched from the porch as the first rays of sunlight cut through the fog. The quiet felt deceptive, almost like the world was pretending nothing had happened the night before. Yet every creak of wood and rustle of leaves reminded her that danger was still near. Inside, Jacob sat at the table reading from the old Bible, his voice calm but steady, the verses grounding him in a world that had begun to shift beneath his feet. Pastor Lewis arrived just before noon, carrying a worn leather satchel and the same letter they had entrusted to him the day before. He told Helen that he had spoken with a retired judge who once handled cases involving the mill. The judge confirmed that there had been rumors of corruption, but the truth had been buried when the company shut down. Pastor Lewis said the letter could reopen the case, but it might also attract unwanted attention. Helen already knew that. She had seen the faces of the men who wanted it hidden. They decided to make a copy of the letter and store the original in the church safe. Helen agreed, but her mind stayed uneasy. She feared that if those men returned and failed to find what they wanted, they would not stop at threats. Pastor Lewis tried to comfort her, saying that faith and truth were stronger than fear. His voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed worry. Before leaving, he prayed with them, asking for protection over the house and courage for the days ahead. That night, Helen and Jacob ate dinner in silence. The wind outside had grown stronger, howling against the windows. Every sound made them flinch. Before bed, Helen walked through each room, checking the locks twice. She stood for a long time by the photo of her husband on the wall. She whispered that his kindness had brought them to this moment, and she hoped he was watching over them still. Jacob came out from his room and asked if she believed people could ever make peace with a past that others tried to erase. Helen told him that truth never dies. It only waits to be found. He nodded, his expression heavy with thought, and returned to his room. The house fell silent again. Just after midnight, a sharp knock broke that silence. Helen froze. The knock came again, louder this time. She grabbed the lamp and moved carefully toward the door. Jacob stepped out of his room, holding the small cross around his neck. When she opened the door, a crack. The sheriff stood there, rain dripping from his hat. Relief flooded through her, but it lasted only a moment. His face was grave. He said they had found one of the men from the mill dead in a nearby town. It looked like someone had silenced him before he could talk. Helen's heart sank. The sheriff warned that whoever was behind it would likely come after the boy next. He offered to take Jacob into town for protection, but Jacob refused. He said he would not hide anymore, that his father's name deserved to be cleared, not forgotten. Helen saw the determination in his eyes and realized that running would not save them. It would only prolong the pain. She asked the sheriff to give them one more day. The sheriff hesitated but agreed, promising to return in the morning with deputies. When the door closed, the house fell quiet again. Helen looked at Jacob and told him they would face whatever came together. She sat by the fire as he drifted to sleep on the couch. The flames flickered, casting long shadows that moved like memories across the walls. She thought about how faith often demanded courage before comfort, and she prayed that courage would not leave her now. At dawn, Helen was awakened by the distant sound of hooves on the dirt road. She rose quickly and looked out the window. A wagon was approaching, 2 men riding beside it, the same faces from that night. Panic shot through her, but she stayed calm. She shook Jacob awake and told him to take the back path through the woods and go to the church. He refused, saying he would not leave her. She insisted, saying that her husband once told her that bravery is not about staying, but about doing what must be done. Reluctantly, Jacob nodded and slipped out the back door. Helen waited by the porch as the men arrived. They dismounted, their boots heavy in the mud. One of them called her name, saying they only wanted to talk. She said they could speak from where they stood. The man smiled coldly and asked for the letter, claiming it belonged to them. Helen said it belonged to the truth, and no one could own that. The man's smile vanished. He stepped closer, his tone hardening. He said she was making a mistake protecting a boy who was nothing but trouble. Helen's voice did not waver as she said that the boy was the only honest thing left from the mess they created. Before the man could reply, a horse galloped up the road. It was the sheriff, followed by 2 deputies. The men turned, cursing under their breath. The sheriff shouted for them to step away. A tense moment passed, the air thick with fear. Then, without another word, the men fled into the woods, disappearing through the fog. The deputies chased after them, but Helen knew it was not over. Those kinds of men did not give up easily. When Jacob returned from the woods, breathless and covered in mud, she ran to him and hugged him tightly. He asked if she was hurt, and she said no, though her heart still raced. The sheriff told them both to pack a few things and stay in town for a while. Helen hesitated. The farmhouse was all she had left of her husband, the place where every memory lived. But when she looked at Jacob, she knew what mattered most now was keeping him safe. They rode into town together that afternoon, sitting in the back of the sheriff's wagon. The sky was grey, and the air smelled of rain again. As the house grew smaller behind them, Helen whispered a prayer that God would guard it until they returned. She knew she was leaving more than a home behind. She was leaving a chapter of pain and discovery that had changed everything. In town, Pastor Lewis arranged a room for them behind the church. It was small but warm, with a single window overlooking the courtyard. That night, Jacob placed his father's letter and the Bible on the table. Helen sat beside him and said that sometimes God uses broken paths to lead us to the truth. Jacob smiled faintly and said he finally understood what his father meant when he spoke about faith being stronger than fear. Over the next few days, the investigation deepened. The sheriff uncovered evidence that tied the dead man to others who had worked at the mill. Old records were reopened, and names that had been forgotten for years began to surface. Pastor Lewis became their advocate, speaking to the judge on their behalf. Word spread quickly through the small town, and people began to talk about the widow who had taken in a lost boy and helped uncover a buried injustice. But as the truth grew closer to light, Helen knew it came at a price. Each step toward justice brought them deeper into danger. One evening, as she sat on the church steps watching the sunset, she asked Jacob if he ever wished he had not come to her fence that night. He looked at her and said no, because finding her meant finding peace. She smiled softly, feeling tears rise. She said that sometimes the people who appear in our darkest moments are the ones God sends to show us we are not alone. The final trial came sooner than expected. The surviving men from the mill were arrested, and the evidence from her husband's letter was presented. The court ruled in favor of Thomas Gray's innocence, restoring his name after years of lies. The judge commended both Helen and Jacob for their courage. The day of the verdict, the church bells rang across the valley, their sound pure and steady. When they returned home to the farmhouse weeks later, the fields were blooming again. The air was filled with birdsong, and the house, though dusty, stood strong. Helen opened the door and felt the warmth of memories rush back. Jacob followed behind her, his eyes wide with quiet awe. He said it felt like the house had been waiting for them. She smiled, saying maybe it had. That evening they sat on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the hills. The valley glowed gold and soft. Helen looked at Jacob and said that her husband used to believe God never wastes pain. He turns it into something good, even when we cannot see how. Jacob nodded and said that maybe his father's suffering had led him here for that very reason. As the sky faded to night, they sat in silence. No longer strangers, but family, bound by truth and grace. Helen knew her life had changed forever, and though she had lost much, she had gained something deeper than she ever expected. Faith renewed, hope restored, and the peace that comes when the past finally rests. The day days after the trial brought a kind of quiet that Helen had not felt in years. The valley seemed to breathe again, as though the truth had washed the land clean. Each morning the sun rose softer, and the songs of the birds carried farther through the hills. Helen spent her hours restoring the farmhouse, dusting the shelves, mending curtains, planting flowers near the porch. Jacob helped her with every task, his hands learning the rhythm of home after too long without one. The boy who had once wandered without direction now moved with purpose, his steps steady and full of meaning. One afternoon, as they worked in the garden, Jacob asked what she planned to do now that everything was settled. Helen smiled and said that peace did not mean stopping. It meant living with gratitude for what had been redeemed. She told him the house was big enough for both of them, and he was welcome to stay as long as he wanted. Jacob looked down at the soil between his fingers and said softly that he had nowhere else to go. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder and told him that sometimes family is not about blood, but about hearts that choose to care. The months passed gently. The fields turned from green to amber, and the air grew cooler as autumn crept across the valley. Life settled into a comforting rhythm. On Sundays, they walked together to church. Pastor Lewis often spoke of forgiveness and the courage it takes to keep faith when life seems unfair. Helen would glance at Jacob during those sermons and see understanding in his eyes. The boy was no longer haunted by the shadows of his past. He had grown into a young man who carried peace instead of pain. One evening, Helen found him in the attic, looking through an old trunk. Inside, he had placed the letters from her husband, the carved wooden bird he once gave her, and the Bible that had guided them through their trials. He said he wanted to keep them together as a reminder of where they had been. Helen nodded, touched by the gesture. She realized then that this house no longer held only her memories, it held his as well. The walls that had once echoed with silence now carried the sound of shared life. But even in their peace, reminders of the past continued to surface. One morning, the sheriff visited to let them know that the last of the men involved in the mill's corruption had been caught. Justice, he said, had finally come full circle. He handed Jacob an old ring that had been found among the man's belongings, engraved with the initials T.G. It was his father's. Jacob held it tightly, tears in his eyes. He thanked the sheriff and said that he no longer hated the men who had taken his father's life. He only hoped their souls would find the truth they had spent so long running from. Helen watched him and felt her heart swell with pride. He had learned what true forgiveness meant. That night, as they sat by the fire, Helen spoke about her husband. She said he had always believed that love outlives loss if we let it guide us. Jacob listened quietly and then said something that stayed with her. Maybe people never really die when their kindness keeps helping others. The words were simple, but carried the weight of everything they had lived through. Helen smiled and told him she believed that with all her heart. As winter approached, they prepared the house for the cold. Jacob repaired the roof, while Helen filled the pantry with preserves and dried fruit. The snow came earlier that year, blanketing the valley in white. The farmhouse looked almost like a painting, smoke rising from the chimney, the fields silent under a layer of frost. On Christmas Eve, they invited Pastor Lewis for dinner. The three of them sat by the fire, sharing stories and laughter. It was the first Christmas Helen had not spent alone since her husband's passing. During that evening, Pastor Lewis shared a small gift with them, a framed verse that read, "Truth and mercy shall meet, righteousness and peace shall kiss." He said it reminded him of their story. Helen placed it above the fireplace where it could be seen each day. The words seemed to belong there, like the final piece of a long-forgotten puzzle. After the pastor left, Helen and Jacob stood by the window watching the snow fall. The world outside was still, the kind of stillness that feels like grace. Jacob said that sometimes he dreamed of his father, not as he last saw him, but as he wished to remember him, smiling, free of pain, and standing beside a man who looked like her husband. Helen felt tears in her eyes, but smiled. She told him that maybe those dreams were not memories, but promises, small glimpses of peace sent by heaven. When spring returned, it brought renewal. The fields bloomed again, and the birds returned to the trees near the porch. Jacob began helping Pastor Lewis at the church, repairing benches and assisting with Sunday school. The children adored him, especially when he carved them little animals out of wood. Helen often watched from the pews, her heart full of quiet joy. She knew that her husband's kindness had not ended with him. It had been passed on to this boy who now lived under her roof. One evening, after the sun had gone down, Helen found Jacob sitting on the porch steps with the Bible open on his lap. He looked at her and said that sometimes he wondered why his father's life had to end the way it did. She sat beside him and said that some lives burn quickly so others can see their light. Jacob nodded and closed the Bible, holding it close. He said he wanted to live in a way that honored both his father and hers. Helen told him that he already was. The years that followed moved gently, marked by simple joys, the harvests, the church gatherings, the laughter shared at the table. The house aged, but its spirit stayed strong. Neighbors often spoke of Helen and the boy she had taken in, calling their story a miracle that proved how faith could turn strangers into family. People came to her for advice, for comfort, for prayer. She never refused anyone. One summer afternoon, Helen sat on the porch, watching Jacob work in the garden. The sunlight caught his hair, and for a moment she saw traces of both the father and the husband she had loved. Two good men whose paths had crossed in pain, but whose goodness had found its way to redemption. She whispered a thank you to heaven, knowing the circle was complete. That night, as the stars spread across the sky, she prayed quietly. She thanked God for second chances, for the strength to forgive, and for the gift of a child who had reminded her that love still lived beyond grief. The air outside was warm, and the sound of crickets carried through the open window. Helen closed her eyes with peace in her heart. She had learned that even after loss, life could still bloom with grace. Weeks later, Jacob came to her with news. Pastor Lewis had asked him to help lead the church's youth program. Helen felt proud and a little emotional. She told him her husband would have smiled at the man he was becoming. Jacob said he owed everything to her, to the night she opened her door, when she could have turned him away. She shook her head and said that kindness was never a favor, it was a calling. That evening they sat together on the porch again. The air smelled of rain and cut grass. Helen looked toward the horizon and said softly that she finally understood why the boy had appeared at her fence that night. Jacob asked what she meant. She said that sometimes God brings the right souls together, not to fix the past, but to heal what was left behind. Jacob smiled and said maybe that was true for both of them. The sky dimmed slowly and the world grew quiet. Helen leaned back in her chair, her eyes on the fading light. She felt the peace that only comes when a long road finds its end, not in sorrow, but in grace. The house behind them glowed with warmth, and in that moment it felt as though the valley itself was breathing in harmony with their hearts. The valley awoke beneath a soft dawn, the kind that painted the world in pale gold and carried the smell of damp earth and blooming fields. Helen opened the window and felt the breeze brush her face. It was the same valley she had known all her life, but it felt different now. There was peace in the air, not because all pain had vanished, but because she and Jacob had learned to live beyond it. Every morning began with purpose, feeding the chickens, tending to the garden, and greeting the day with quiet gratitude. Jacob had grown taller, his voice steadier, his steps firmer. He carried himself with the calm of someone who had found meaning after chaos. Each Sunday, he helped Pastor Lewis prepare the church for service, arranging the hymn books and lighting the candles before the congregation arrived. The townspeople often spoke of him with admiration, calling him the boy who turned his father's tragedy into a story of hope. Whenever Helen heard those words, her eyes would fill with quiet pride. She knew the journey that brought him there had been anything but easy. One afternoon, as the church bell rang across the valley, Helen sat on the porch knitting while Jacob repaired the old fence near the barn. The sound of the hammer echoed softly, blending with the rustle of leaves. She watched him work and thought of the night she first found him by the fence, cold and frightened. It felt like another lifetime. Sometimes she still wondered why God had chosen her to find him that day. Perhaps it was to remind her that kindness is never wasted, that love can find us even in the quiet corners of loss. That evening, they shared supper at the table, the same table that had once been covered in dust and silence. Jacob told her that Pastor Lewis planned to expand the church and build a small shelter for travelers and children with no home. He said he wanted to help lead the project. Helen felt tears prick her eyes as she listened. She told him that her husband would have been proud, and Jacob smiled, saying he hoped to honor both of them through his work. The following weeks brought a rhythm of peace. The valley's colors shifted with the season, greens deepened, the fields thickened with crops, and the air turned sweet with the scent of ripening fruit. Helen began teaching Jacob how to cook the old family recipes her husband used to love. They laughed when the bread burned or when the flour dusted their faces like snow. It was simple, ordinary joy, yet to Helen it felt miraculous. After years of grief, the sound of laughter in her home was a kind of healing she had thought she would never know again. One morning, as she was sorting through drawers, Helen found an old envelope tucked behind a pile of papers. It contained a photograph she had never noticed before. It showed her husband standing beside a young man, Thomas Gray, and between them, a small boy, barely 4 years old. Her hands trembled as she realized who it was. The same eyes, the same faint scar on the wrist. Jacob. The picture had been taken long before the tragedy, back when both families had known peace. She sat there for a long moment, the weight of years settling softly on her chest. When Jacob came in from the yard, she showed him the photo. He stared at it quietly, tracing his father's face with his thumb. He asked her how she felt seeing it now. Helen said that sometimes God lets the past find its way back to us, not to reopen wounds, but to remind us how far we have come. Jacob nodded, his eyes filled with something between sorrow and gratitude. He said he was glad the photo had found her last, not first, because now they were ready to face what it meant. That night, they placed the photo on the mantel beside the Bible and the carved bird. Together, those 3 things told their story: faith, hope, and redemption, bound by time. Helen looked at them and thought that maybe this was what healing truly looked like. Not the absence of pain, but the transformation of it into meaning. As the years continued, the farmhouse became a place of welcome for others. Strangers passing through town often stopped by for water, a meal, or a place to rest. Helen never turned anyone away. Some called her the woman with the open door. Jacob often joked that her kindness had become famous across the county. But to Helen, it was not fame, it was obedience to the lesson life had taught her, that giving love never empties the heart. One autumn afternoon, Pastor Lewis fell ill. Helen and Jacob spent days caring for him, bringing him soup and reading him scripture. Before he passed, he took Helen's hand and told her that she had done more good with her quiet faith than most people did with sermons. He turned to Jacob and said that God had chosen him to carry that goodness forward. His words became a seed in Jacob's soul, one that would shape the rest of his life. After the funeral, Helen and Jacob stood together outside the church, the wind moving gently through the trees. The bell rang softly, its tone low and steady. Jacob said that he wanted to take over some of Pastor Lewis's duties. Helen smiled and said she knew he would, because faith was already part of him. The next Sunday, Jacob gave his first message at the small evening service. The church was full, the pews lined with neighbors who had watched him grow. Helen sat in the front row, her hands clasped, her heart full. Jacob spoke about forgiveness, about how even broken things could still reflect light. His voice was calm and sure, carrying through the old wooden walls. When he finished, the congregation rose in silence, then applause. Helen felt tears roll down her cheeks. It was as if she were watching her husband's kindness reborn in another generation. When they walked home that night, the stars stretched across the sky like scattered candles. The air was cool, and the earth smelled of rain. Jacob said softly that he wished his father could see him now. Helen looked up at the sky and said maybe he already did. They both fell silent, the moment wrapping around them like a prayer. Months later, Helen's health began to slow her down. Her hands trembled when she worked, and her steps grew shorter, but her spirit stayed strong. Jacob took over most of the chores and insisted she rest more often. She teased him, saying she had not raised him to treat her like a fragile glass, and he laughed. Still, she knew he worried. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset, she said that life had given her more than she ever expected. She had known sorrow and joy, loss and grace, grace, and through it all, faith had carried her like a steady hand. Jacob said that she had given him everything, a home, a future, and a reason to believe. She looked at him and said, "No, Jacob, you gave me life again." The sky darkened, and the first stars appeared. Helen leaned back, feeling the quiet peace that only comes after a long road. The wind moved gently through the fields, whispering through the leaves. Jacob stayed beside her, neither speaking nor needing to. The valley stretched out before them, endless and calm. She smiled faintly, knowing deep within her that the story God had written for them had reached its quiet blessing. The summer that followed was warm and generous. The fields shimmered beneath the sunlight, and the days seemed to last longer than before. Helen woke earlier each morning, not because she had to, but because she wanted to watch the light slowly fill the valley. She would sit by the window with her cup of coffee, listening to the distant hum of life awakening around her, the birds in the trees, the wind against the fence, the faint sound of Jacob chopping wood near the barn. These small sounds had become her favorite kind of music. They meant peace, stability, and a quiet grace that time had finally given back to her. Jacob had turned into a man whose presence carried calm wherever he went. People from nearby towns began visiting the church just to hear him speak. His sermons were not filled with grand words, but with truth spoken gently, the kind that reached hearts without force. Helen attended every service, sitting near the front, her hands folded over her Bible. She watched him with pride, not because he was perfect, but because she had seen the road that had shaped him, the long walk from pain to purpose. One day after church, a woman approached Helen and said she was the daughter of one of the men who had worked at the mill long ago. She thanked Helen for what she had done for Jacob and for restoring her own father's name through the truth that had come out years earlier. The woman said that her family had lived with shame for a long time, believing lies that had broken them apart. Helen listened quietly and then said that truth has a way of mending what deceit tries to destroy. The woman cried and hugged her before leaving. That moment reminded Helen how deeply one act of mercy can travel beyond what the eye can see. As the years passed, the farmhouse continued to stand strong. Its walls aged gracefully, and the porch carried the marks of countless seasons' rain, sunlight, and the steady steps of two lives lived fully. Jacob kept everything in order. He repainted the shutters, replaced the old fence, and even restored the barn roof. Helen often told him that the house looked better now than it did when she was young. He would laugh and say that perhaps it was because love had finally become its foundation. That autumn, Helen fell ill for the first time in years. It began as a simple cough, but soon her strength started to fade. She insisted it was nothing, but Jacob saw the worry in her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. He stayed close, making her tea, cooking meals, and sitting with her during the nights when she couldn't sleep. The house that had once sheltered him now became a place where he could return every kindness she had ever shown him. One evening, when the wind rattled softly against the window, Helen asked him to sit beside her. The fire burned low in the hearth, casting soft orange light across the room. She told him that every chapter of life ends, but God never wastes a single line. Jacob tried to hide the tears that welled in his eyes, saying she still had many years ahead. She smiled gently and said that life is not measured by years, but by love given and received. She told him that he had given her enough love to fill several lifetimes. Over the next few weeks, her body weakened, but her spirit never dimmed. She often asked Jacob to read from the Bible, especially the passages about peace and eternal rest. Sometimes she would close her eyes and hum softly while he read. The sound of her voice, even faint, filled the room with warmth. One morning, when the fields outside were covered in mist, Helen asked Jacob to open the window. The air was cool, carrying the smell of rain and earth. She said that it reminded her of the day she first found him by the fence. She asked if he remembered. He nodded, his voice breaking as he said that day had saved his life. Helen smiled and said that maybe it had saved hers too. Then she took his hand and whispered that love never ends, it only changes its shape. That afternoon, she rested quietly. The sunlight through the window moved slowly across her blanket, tracing gentle patterns like hands of light. Jacob sat by her side, holding her hand until the evening came. The room was peaceful, and when he realized she had gone, it was as though the entire valley had paused to breathe. The days that followed were quiet. The town came together to honor her life. People from miles around attended her service. Pastor Lewis had long passed, but the new pastor spoke of her kindness and the way she had changed lives without ever seeking recognition. Jacob stood beside the casket, his heart heavy but steady. He felt sorrow, but not despair, because he knew she had found the peace she always spoke about. He buried her beside her husband, under the large oak tree that overlooked the valley. The air was still that day, and the sky was painted with a soft gold glow. Jacob placed the carved wooden bird, the photograph, and the small Bible on her grave. He whispered a prayer of gratitude, not just for her life, but for the chance to have shared it. Weeks later, Jacob moved through the house slowly, touching each object she had left behind. Every room carried her memory, the scent of her soap, the soft hum she used to make while cleaning, the small notes she left on the table reminding herself to water the plants. He kept everything as it was, not out of grief, but respect. The house had become a living memory of her grace. As time passed, Jacob continued her legacy. The farmhouse became a place for travelers and children with no home, just as Pastor Lewis once dreamed. People found refuge there, warmth and faith. On the porch, a small wooden sign read, "The Open Door." Jacob said Helen had named it that without ever realizing it. Years rolled by. The valley changed, the people changed, but the story of the widow and the lost boy lingered like a quiet legend told across generations. Children growing up in town would point toward the farmhouse and whisper that something holy lived there. One late afternoon, Jacob stood on the same porch where Helen had once sat watching the horizon. The sun dipped behind the hills, and the sky glowed like embers. He felt the wind move gently, and in that wind there was peace. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer of thanks for the woman who had taught him that even sorrow could bloom into grace. As twilight deepened, he opened the Bible Helen had given him. Inside the front cover, her handwriting remained clear. Love is the only story that never ends. Jacob smiled and looked toward the valley one last time. The light of the setting sun fell across the porch, warm and soft. In that moment, he felt not alone, but surrounded by memory, by faith, by the quiet certainty that love had fulfilled its promise. The farmhouse stood, as it always had, a beacon of mercy at the heart of Tennessee's fields, carrying forever the story of a widow who took in a lost boy and discovered through him who she truly was. Years drifted like gentle wind across the valley, carrying stories from one generation to another. The farmhouse, now known simply as the Open Door, became a place of quiet pilgrimage. Travelers stopped to rest. Children ran through the yard, and every corner of the house seemed alive with echoes of kindness. Though Helen was gone, her presence remained as real as the morning light that filtered through the curtains. People said her spirit lingered in the sound of the wind chimes that Jacob had hung on the porch, the same place where she once sat at sunset watching the world with calm faith. Jacob had grown older, his hair touched with grey, his shoulders broader but softened by years of compassion. He still worked in the fields, though slower now. The land that once belonged to Helen and her husband had become his life's work, not as a possession, but as a responsibility. Every row he ploughed, every fence he repaired, felt like an act of gratitude. In town, people spoke of him with the same reverence they once reserved for Helen. They said the boy she rescued had grown into the kind of man who rescued others. On Sunday mornings, the church bells still rang, their sound carrying far across the hills. Jacob continued to speak at the services, sharing lessons of forgiveness and hope. His words were simple, yet they carried weight because they came from a life lived through loss and redemption. He often told the congregation that truth is not something you find once, it is something you live every day. He would remind them that Helen's greatest act was not taking in a lost boy, but believing that grace could still grow in broken soil. In one of his sermons, he shared a story from their past. He spoke about the night Helen found him by the fence, cold and hungry, and how she saw not a stranger, but a soul worth saving. He said that moment changed everything. The people listened in silence, many of them with tears in their eyes. When the service ended, they came forward to shake his hand, some thanking him for reminding them that mercy always begins with a single open door. After church, Jacob returned home, walking the same dirt path that he once followed as a scared child. The fence still stood where Helen had found him, though the wood was old and covered in moss. He placed his hand on one of the posts and smiled. He whispered that he was home, that he had kept his promise to her, to live with faith and carry her kindness into every corner of his life. Inside the farmhouse, the air was cool and smelled faintly of lavender, just as Helen used to keep it. The walls were lined with framed verses and photographs. One photo showed Helen and him on the porch during one of their last summers together. She was smiling, her eyes soft with peace. He had kept that photo polished and placed it near the window where the light could reach it every morning. Beside it sat the small wooden bird, the Bible, and the photograph of his father with Helen's husband. Those three objects had outlived everyone who once held them, yet they still told the story that defined his life. As the afternoon sun warmed the porch, Jacob sat with a cup of coffee, looking out across the valley. The fields were golden again, just as they had been when he was a boy. He could still hear Helen's voice reminding him to be kind, even when it was hard, to forgive, even when it hurt, and to trust that God never leaves a story unfinished. He often spoke those words to himself whenever doubt crept in. They had become his prayer. That year, a young woman arrived at the farmhouse. She was traveling from another county, lost and looking for work. She had heard of the open door from the pastor in town. Her name was Grace, and she carried a small bag and a weary look that Jacob recognized instantly, the same look he once carried himself. He offered her a warm meal and a place to rest for the night. When she asked why he was helping her, he smiled and said, "Because someone once helped me." Grace stayed longer than one night. She began helping with chores, tending the garden and caring for the guests who came seeking shelter. Her laughter brought youth back into the old house. Jacob saw in her the same spark that Helen had seen in him, a quiet resilience hidden beneath fear. Over time, she became like family. Together they continued the work Helen had started, turning the farmhouse into a true sanctuary for the broken and the lost. One evening, after the last visitor had left, Grace asked Jacob to tell her more about the woman who had built all of this with nothing but faith. Jacob leaned back in his chair and began to tell her the story, the cold evening when Helen found him, the days of mystery and fear, the truth that had changed both their lives. As he spoke, the memories unfolded like pages of an old book. His voice was steady, but full of emotion. Grace listened intently, her eyes shining with tears. When he finished, she said that Helen sounded like the kind of person the world needed more of. Jacob nodded and said softly, "She was one of a kind, but kindness has a way of multiplying." Years continued to pass, and with each season, more people came to the open door. Farmers seeking work, widows with no family, children who had lost their parents, all found shelter there. Jacob made sure every person who entered left with food, warmth, and a renewed sense of hope. He often thought of Helen when he watched someone eat a meal at that same old table. He could almost see her sitting across from them, smiling with that gentle look of understanding that had once saved him. As age settled deeper into his bones, Jacob began to slow down. Grace took over most of the work, running the house with the same spirit of kindness. She often teased Jacob for being too stubborn to rest, but he would just smile and say that rest comes easiest when a life has been lived for others. In the quiet hours of evening, he would sit on the porch watching the sun fade, whispering small prayers of thanks for Helen, for his father, for the valley, and for the grace that had carried him through. One night, a storm rolled through the hills. The wind howled, and rain lashed against the windows. Jacob stayed up, reading from the Bible by the fire. When the storm calmed, he looked toward the mantel where Helen's photograph sat. He said softly, "I kept your promise." The door stayed open. The following morning, Grace found him sitting peacefully in his chair, the Bible still open in his lap. The fire had burned down to embers. There was no sign of struggle, only calm. His face looked serene, as if he had fallen asleep in faith. The light from the window touched his features gently, and in that moment the house felt full of presence again. Helen's, his father's, and every soul who had once found refuge there. Grace buried him beside Helen and her husband, under the same oak tree overlooking the valley. She placed the wooden bird and the Bible beside his grave, just as he had done for Helen years before. The people of the town gathered to honor him, their voices quiet, but filled with respect. They spoke of his kindness, his faith, and the home he had built for those who had nowhere else to go. From that day on, Grace kept the open door alive. She welcomed everyone as Jacob had, carrying forward the legacy of 2 lives bound by mercy. And on quiet evenings, when the sun dipped behind the Tennessee hills, she would sit on the porch and swear she could hear the faint sound of laughter, like echoes of the past carried on the wind. The farmhouse still stands in the valley, weathered but strong. Its light glows each night for travelers who lose their way. And though Helen and Jacob are long gone, their story remains: a widow who opened her door to a lost boy, and a boy who grew to open his heart to the world. The years moved quietly through the valley, like a hymn carried on the wind. Generations passed, but the open door never closed. Travelers continued to arrive, sometimes by accident, sometimes by faith. They came weary and left lighter, their hearts warmed by the spirit that lived within those wooden walls. Helen's name had long faded from most memories, but her kindness had not. It was spoken in whispers, in prayers, and in stories told by firesides throughout the Tennessee hills. Grace, now older herself, walked the same paths Jacob once did. She cared for the garden, polished the wooden steps, and kept the lantern burning on the porch each night. She had inherited more than a house. She had inherited a mission. People often asked her why she never locked her doors. She would smile and say that some doors were built not for safety, but for salvation. When the nights grew long, she sometimes spoke aloud, as though Jacob could still hear her. She would tell him about the people who came and went, the children who laughed in the yard, and how the valley still felt full of peace. Inside the farmhouse, nothing had been changed unnecessarily. The Bible still rested on the mantel, beside the photograph and the small wooden bird. The pages of the book were worn and soft from years of hands turning them in search of comfort. Grace read from it each morning, her voice low and steady, letting the words fill the air like a gentle reminder that love outlasts everything else. One evening, a traveler stopped by, a middle-aged man whose clothes were dusty from the road. He said he had heard about the place from a family in another town, people who claimed their lives had been changed by a stay at the open door. Grace welcomed him in, offered soup, and listened to his story. He had lost his job, his family had moved away, and he had been wandering from town to town looking for meaning. When he finished eating, he asked her why she kept helping strangers. She smiled softly and said, "Because I was once helped when I didn't even know I needed saving." As the man prepared to leave the next morning, he paused by the mantel. His eyes rested on the photograph of Helen and Jacob. He asked who they were. Grace told him their story, from the cold night when a widow found a lost boy to the legacy that stood around them. The man listened quietly, his expression full of wonder. Before he left, he said he would never forget it, and he didn't. Weeks later, letters began arriving from people in distant towns, thanking Grace for what she had done, though she hadn't met most of them. The traveler had carried the story forward, passing it from one place to another like a living blessing. Seasons turned again. Winter came with soft snow, wrapping the valley in white. Grace grew slower, but her spirit stayed strong. On cold nights, she sat near the fire reading Jacob's journal. He had written about the day Helen took him in, about the faith she gave him when his heart had forgotten how to believe. His handwriting grew shakier in the later pages, but his words remained steady. The last line in the book read, "Kindness is the echo of heaven." Grace closed the journal gently each time she read it, letting those words settle in her heart. As the years continued, the farmhouse began to age. Paint peeled, the porch leaned slightly, but the door never failed to open. Grace repaired what she could, and when she couldn't, the townspeople came to help. It was no longer just her home. It belonged to everyone who believed in what it stood for. Mothers brought food, Children helped plant flowers, and the pastor often stopped by to pray in the yard. The place became more than a shelter. It became a symbol of faith that had endured longer than any one life. One spring afternoon, Grace stood under the old oak tree that overlooked the valley. Beneath it lay Helen, Jacob, and her husband. The ground was covered with wildflowers, their colors soft and bright under the sun. Grace knelt and placed her hand on the grass. She whispered that the house still stood, that the light still shone, and that the kindness they had planted had not died. The breeze lifted her hair gently, and for a moment she felt a warmth around her shoulders, almost like an embrace. She smiled, knowing that the same spirit that had guided them still lived in her. That evening, the sunset filled the sky with a deep orange glow. The house seemed to glow with it, every window reflecting light like a lantern in the hills. Grace stood on the porch, watching the horizon, her heart full of peace. She thought about all the lives that had crossed paths there, how pain had turned to purpose, how sorrow had become hope. She whispered a prayer of thanks for Helen and Jacob, for the lesson they had taught the world, that even the smallest act of compassion can echo through time. When darkness fell, she lit the lantern on the porch and left the door slightly open, as Helen once had. The wind moved softly through the valley, carrying the scent of rain and the faint sound of crickets. From somewhere deep within the night, it almost felt as though laughter drifted on the air, the gentle laughter of two souls watching over the home they had built together. In the years that followed, new caretakers came to live in the farmhouse. Families with children, young couples, old friends, they all became part of the legacy. Each added something of their own, but none ever changed the name. The open door remained what it had always been, a refuge for hearts that had forgotten hope. Travelers came still, guided by word, by faith, or perhaps by something greater. Today, if one walks through the Tennessee hills at dusk, they can still see the soft glow of light through the farmhouse windows. Inside, the Bible still rests on the mantel. The small wooden bird still stands watch by the window. And above the fireplace, where Helen once hung her favorite verse, the words remain clear. Truth and mercy shall meet. Righteousness and peace shall kiss. Some say that on quiet nights, when the wind moves just right, the sound of a woman's voice can be heard, gentle, calm, and full of warmth, welcoming travelers home. And if you listen closely, you might hear her say, "Come in, the door is open." The story of the widow and the lost boy had become timeless, not a tale of sadness, but of redemption, not of endings, but of beginnings. It reminded everyone who heard it that love, once given, never disappears. It keeps finding its way through generations, through hearts, through open doors. Decades later, the story of the open door had grown into something almost sacred among the people of Tennessee. The farmhouse still stood on the same hill, its wooden frame worn by weather but strong in spirit. Time had carved lines into its walls, but each mark told a story. New caretakers lived there now, a young couple with 2 children who had heard whispers of the house's history before they ever stepped inside. They didn't come seeking miracles, only a quiet life. But the moment they crossed the threshold, they felt something different. The air seemed thick with warmth, as if kindness itself still lived in the corners of each room. The couple, Sarah and Luke, decided to keep the name just as it had always been. The Open Door was more than a name. It was a promise. They placed a small plaque beside the entrance with an inscription that read, "Here, every soul finds rest." Sarah often said she could feel the house's peace wrapping around her whenever she prayed. Luke repaired the old porch swing where Helen once sat, and their children played near the fence where she had first found Jacob so many years ago. The world around them had changed. Cars replaced wagons, lights replaced lanterns, but the heart of the place remained untouched. In the town nearby, elders still told the story. They spoke of a widow who had opened her heart to a lost boy, and of the boy who had grown into a man who changed lives. They said the house had seen sorrow, grace, and miracles. Children would listen wide-eyed as old voices described how a single act of compassion had rippled through generations, reaching people who would never know Helen's name, but would live because of her kindness. Inside the farmhouse, the mantel still carried the same treasures: the wooden bird, the Bible, the photograph, and the verse that read, "Truth and mercy shall meet, righteousness and peace shall kiss." Sarah kept them polished, believing they were part of what made the house feel alive. On quiet nights, when rain tapped softly against the windows, she would read from that Bible aloud, her voice calm and steady, the way Helen's once had been. The children would sit by the fire, listening not just to the words, but to the feeling behind them, the same feeling that had guided so many hearts before theirs. One afternoon, while cleaning the attic, Sarah found a small box hidden beneath the old floorboards. Inside were letters written in a man's hand, Jacob's handwriting. The ink had faded, but the words were still clear. They were letters he had written to Helen after her passing, words he never sent, but kept as a prayer. In one he wrote, "You opened a door for me when I had nothing to give. I will spend my life making sure that door never closes." Sarah pressed the letter to her heart, tears filling her eyes. She placed the box back where she found it, whispering a thank you to the ones who had come before her. That night, she told her husband about the letters. Together they decided to frame one of them and hang it beside the fireplace. The children asked who Helen and Jacob were, and Sarah told them everything: the cold night by the fence, the mystery that led to truth, and the faith that built a home. Her voice trembled as she said that real miracles don't always shine bright. Sometimes they begin quietly, with one open door. Over the years, the open door became more than a house again. It became a gathering place. People came for Sunday meals, for prayer circles, for comfort when life felt too heavy. Strangers became friends under that roof. When someone asked Sarah why she gave so much of her time to others, she always said the same thing: because that's what this house was built for. As time passed, her children grew and moved away, but they always returned for the holidays. Each time they stepped onto the porch, they would pause, close their eyes, and take in the feeling that lived there, the peace, the faith, the quiet love. Luke passed away first, and when Sarah grew too old to tend the garden, her children took turns caring for her. One spring morning, when the fields were green and the valley smelled of new rain, she passed peacefully in her sleep. She was buried beside the oak tree, near Helen, Jacob, and all those who had come before. The next generation continued what their parents began. They repaired the farmhouse, restored the barn, and reopened the doors to travelers once more. The name never changed. Through the decades, the story became a part of local legend, told in schools, churches, and family gatherings. Yet despite how many times it was retold, no one could quite capture the feeling of the place itself, the stillness, the grace, the sense that unseen hands guided everything that happened there. Even in modern times, when the world moved faster and people forgot to look for quiet miracles, the open door remained a refuge. Travelers came not because of signs or advertisements, but because something in their hearts drew them there. Some said they dreamed of the house before finding it, that a woman's voice had told them to keep walking, that they would know when they arrived. When they reached the porch and felt the warm light spilling through the window, they always said the same thing: they felt home. On clear nights, the stars over the valley glimmered brighter than anywhere else. The wind carried the scent of earth and old wood, and if one listened closely, there was still that familiar hum, a sound between memory and faith. The house seemed to breathe with life, as though the souls of those who had lived and loved there still watched over it. Some evenings, when the lantern flickered just right, it almost looked as if shadows moved gently across the porch, as if Helen and Jacob were still sitting side by side, keeping watch over every lost traveler who found their way to that sacred place. The story of the open door became a lesson across generations. Teachers in town would tell their students that goodness never ends where it begins. Parents would remind their children that every act of love changes the world in ways they may never see. And preachers spoke of Helen's legacy not as a miracle, but as a living example of what faith can do when it is lived, not preached. Many decades later, a writer passing through the area heard the story from an old woman in a diner. He visited the farmhouse, now preserved by the community, and spent hours walking its rooms, touching the old wood, breathing in the quiet peace that filled it. He decided to write the story, not to make it grand, but to remind people that grace often begins with small things: a fence, a bowl of soup, a warm bed, an open heart. His book was simple, but it touched millions. generations. People from all over the world came to see the open door, not as a monument, but as a home where love had once changed the course of lives. And still, through all the years, the light in that house never went out. On nights when storms rolled over the valley, travelers said the glow from the windows was the brightest thing in the dark, guiding them forward like a beacon. They would knock, and someone inside, whoever lived there at the time, would always answer with the same words passed down through generations. "Come in, you're safe here, the door is open." The story had come full circle. What began as a simple act of compassion between a widow and a lost boy became a legacy that outlived them both. And even now, long after their names faded from memory, their faith remained alive in every meal shared, in every prayer whispered, in every hand that reached out to help another. Because in the end, the open door was never just a place. It was a truth that mercy outlasts time, that kindness builds eternity, and that love, real, selfless love, never dies.